Okay, got a 1998 Land Rover Discovery. I wanted to do some improvements to the fuel economy. So I put in a 300 TDI conversion. My fuel economy went from about 10 to 23 miles per gallon. And now I want to do a little bit better than that. I've tweaked the fuel control and got a little more horsepower and stuff out of that, but it didn't really change the economy. So what I'm going to do is CNG. So let's talk about what CNG will do for you. So currently now gasoline or diesel is $4 a gallon and CNG is $1.58. Typically when you do a fumigated CNG, you're running it at about 50%. Some people say they can run it at 70% CNG and 30% diesel, but I think that ratio is too high. You're going to destroy your engine. A lot of people say when they get CNG, they double their fuel economy. Well, that's kind of true for the diesel, but you got to remember you're also putting in CNG, and unless you got an uncle who gives that to you for free, it costs money. So a typical diesel right now is $4 a gallon. CNG is $1.58 in Utah currently. So that's $5.58 for 2 gallons. Divide that by 2, and now our fuel cost is $2.79 a gallon. That's the CNG and the diesel. If I drive 15,000 miles, and I'm currently getting 23 miles per gallon, just on diesel, with the CNG, it's $2.79 times 652 miles, and it'll cost me $1,820 to operate. That versus if I drove 15,000 miles, still got to 23 miles per gallon because I got the diesel. Instead of it being $2.79, it's $4 a gallon. It would cost me $2,608. And this is all rough estimates. Whereas before, I drove 15,000 miles at 10 miles per gallon with the gas. I used 1,500 gallons of gas at $3.80 a gallon. It cost me $5,700. So with the CNG and the diesel conversion, I'll save 69% roughly less than I did when I just had the gas motor, and 31% less than just keeping it with the diesel. So it's not a 50% fuel savings, but it is substantial, especially the CNG with the diesel over just the gasoline, which is $5,700. That's quite substantial. The difference between the diesel and the CNG isn't significant, but the CNG also adds the added benefit of increased horsepower and cleaner running engine. It's probably 45% less particulate pollution, and that's not bad. So I'm going to put in the CNG and the diesel. And there's quite a few aspects to it. Not that much. It's actually pretty, not that complicated. You've got a high pressure line that's going to come from my trunk where I'm going to have the high pressure tank. You've got a regulator for the CNG. It drops the CNG from 3,000 PSI down to, I think it's like 5 PSI, I'm not quite sure. And then I have a fill valve and a shutoff valve. There's a few other components, and I'm going to go into those into detail. The tank is pretty substantial. Sometimes you wonder if it's really worth it. I think I'm doing this more for the gee whiz of it, because this thing will take up the entire trunk. There's going to be a little space on the front side. It's a little messy right now. It's not done. This particular tank is a Type 4 tank. It's made out of composite material. Type 1 tanks are steel. They're very, very heavy. Type 2s and 3s are aluminum and aluminum composite, which is lighter. And then this composite is much lighter. This is a 10 GGE, gasoline gallon equivalent. In other words, this is equivalent to 10 gallons of gasoline. But as you can see, that tank is massive. However, I'm not going to be charging it at the 3,600 PSI. I'm only going to be charging it at the 3,000 PSI. So I'll probably get about 7.5 gallons out of this massive tank. So it's reduced quite a bit. When you're mounting these, they need to be mounted with substantial brackets. I think it's 10 times the weight is the force that you should allow these brackets to be rated at. I'll have 2 of them. Currently, I just have the ones just sitting here. The valve itself, this one has a manual shutoff valve. There's some that have electronic shutoff valves. This is your overpressurization port, and this will be ported outside if the tank should overpressurize. You don't want the tank to explode, so it'll actually port it outside. This fitting here would be if you were to have more than one tank, and obviously I'm not going to be putting more than one tank in here. And then if you look over here, this is where my actual outlet will be. This tank comes with standard fittings. I had to put on a metric conversion fitting because the lines I have are metric. Most of the CNG kits are made in Argentina, some in Italy, and China is now becoming a larger force in the CNG market. So you have to run a high pressure line down. What I did is I chose to follow it along the lines of the brake lines and air conditioning lines, so that way it's safe. Needs to be secured, protected from vibration and wear, because if you allow that to happen, then you're going to be in big trouble. You don't want to have a CNG leak. This is a regulator. This is a red gas pocket regulator, and what this does is it takes that gas, and some of these tanks can be 3,600 psi. Mine's just going to be set to 3,000 psi. It brings it in here and it drops it down to a usable pressure for your intake. So on this thing, you have your high pressure inlet, and then this is where you can mount a gauge. So you'll mount the gauge there and here. You also have these 2 ports right here, and what they are is they actually go to your heater lines, and you're going to need the supply and the return, and you're going to bring them over. I'm actually going to mount my regulator over here, and what that does is when you're dropping pressure like from 3,000 psi down to a much lower pressure, you're going to have a pressure drop, obviously, and with that you have a temperature drop. So what will happen is you'll have freezing inside here, and then this won't work properly. So what we do is we port the heater water, radiator water, whatever you want to call it, through here, and that'll prevent this thing from freezing over. So you have your high pressure inlet. Now here's your low pressure outlet, and this will go to your intake manifold. And then this is the solenoid that allows it to turn on. Now, even though you electronically turn on your solenoid, it's not on until this actually receives a vacuum, and then it overcomes the pressure in the diaphragm and allows the fuel to flow. So it takes 2 things to actually make this regulator go. So this is not actually mounted, it's just sitting in here. Okay, so this is my high pressure line coming in from my tank. When I bring it in, I'm going to want to coil it around before I actually attach it to my fill valve. And the importance of that is you want to be able to allow that to flex, as opposed to if you had it rigidly mounted to something, you're putting all that pressure right on that point, and you can cause breakage. This is the fill port. Let's see if I can get you a side profile. Again, this is not mounted currently. This particular fill port is rated at 3,000 psi. So when you go to the CNG filling station, there's 2 types of pumps, a 3,600 and a 3,000 psi. You can only go to the 3,000 psi one. If you had a 3,600 psi connector here, then you could go to either 3,000 or 3,600. I'm going to stick with the 3,000 at least for now, unless it just gets to be ridiculous. As I said, off of my regulator, I have a gauge that gives me the pressure of how much is in the tank, and it also has a sending unit. I'm going to run a actual gauge into the inside of the car to show me how much CNG I have left, so I know when to fill up. when you're doing this, you want to make sure that you install a pyrometer, because you don't want to over-temp your engine and burn it up. And there's a greater possibility whenever you do any performance mods, especially on diesels, install a pyrometer, protect your engine. What's neat about this pyrometer, it's an all-burr. You can program it to set an alarm at a particular temperature. This one will be set at 1350 degrees Fahrenheit. It'll sound a beeper, so that way I'm not just relying on an indication. This will actually light up, a little blue light, telling me I'm in a over temp condition. You can also take that, and there's a set of contacts in there that you can switch off your CNG if you wanted to do that. I don't think I'm going to do that because I think it might be too much of a jump. You know, suddenly losing 50% of the fuel going to the engine probably wouldn't be so good. So I'm just going to rely on the indication and the beeper to tell me, hey, throttle it back or shut off my CNG. So we'll go over the just a basic install of what's needed, and we'll go from there. Okay, here's the basic plumbing of the system. Sorry, I'm not a computer guy, so I can't do this on the computer. You have your tank, which is pressurized at 3,000 psi, at least in my case. Maybe you'll pressurize yours to 3,600. On that tank, there's a valve. I showed you that earlier. You can manually shut off the system in case there's a leak or you're not going to be using it for a while. It's probably a good idea to shut it off. From there, you're going to have the high pressure line that comes from your trunk all the way up to your engine compartment. And you're going to have your manual shut-off valve. And on that valve, you're also going to have a gauge. From that gauge, it goes to your regulator. And then your regulator will drop that 3,000 or 3,600 psi down to 5 psi. And that's simply ported into your intake before your turbo. And then you have your two heater core lines that keep the regulator from freezing because of the pressure drop. So what I'm talking about is the tank is in the trunk. Pardon my walking around. As I said, you have your tank that's mounted in the trunk, the manual shutoff valve. From there, it goes out to down out along your car, safely mounted from abrasion and all that other stuff. Comes up to your engine compartment, ties into your shutoff valve / fill port, and then it'll come across, again, remember to coil, to your pressure regulator, and your gauge is sitting right there. This one has a sending unit, so it'll send it into the thing. Then you have your low pressure line out, which is this, and it'll just go into your intake right here. The vacuum that's created during acceleration will allow the CNG to flow. Then you have your two water ports. Those lines are going to be run over and pick up your heater core. And that's pretty much it for the plumbing of it all. Okay, the wiring for it is very simple. A gasoline engine is a lot different. You got to pick up a throttle position sensor, your O2 sensor, the ignition coil to let it know that the engine's running, so it should actually send fuel. This is a little different. This is a rudimentary diesel. This diesel doesn't have a throttle position sensor or O2 sensors or anything like that. They do have diesel kits where you actually utilize that. But anyhow, you've got an ignition line coming into your CNG on-off switch, which is inside your car. I'm going to actually hook this up to my brake switch. So whenever my brake goes on, it'll energize a relay that'll open this up, and then I'll lose power to my regulator. There's no sense powering CNG in a braking condition. You don't need the extra fuel, and it'll save a little bit of save a little bit of fuel. Anyhow, and then your power line just goes into your solenoid on your regulator, and you got to make sure your regulator is grounded. So here's your solenoid on your regulator right there. You just pick up the power line, you bring your power line in here. When this is energized, it allows the regulator to open up and work when there's a vacuum. Remember, you have to ground your regulator. So if you, for some reason, decide to zip tie, which would be insane, your regulator to something and this is not grounded, then this solenoid won't work and the system won't work. There's an alternative thing that I was thinking of doing, and again, sorry I don't have computer programs. Same design, ignition, the on-off switch, the brake light switch, but I was going to add the EGT. If I go over 1350 degrees Fahrenheit, on the indicator, it actually has a set of contacts that I can run to a relay, and it'll open this up, taking the power away from the regulator and cutting off the CNG. So pretty simple, on-off switch, brake light switch, that's optional, you do not have to do that. And the EGT, if you wanted to do that also. I will go through the normally closed contacts so that the relay doesn't have to be energized for it to run, but if it is energized, it'll shut it off. And that should be it for the wiring, pretty straightforward. Again, this is a mechanical fuel injection system, so there's no throttle position sensor, there's no nothing. I've just got my cable coming into my, gosh, I don't know why it keeps slipping me, my fuel control. So, you know, and I do not have a oxygen sensor for feedback or anything like that. So very basic system. It won't be as efficient as, say, one with a throttle position sensor, because what it does on the throttle position sensor is it actually regulates the amount of fuel that CNG will be ported into your intake. And that's the one thing I did not go over. Okay, the one thing I did not go over, you've got your low pressure line coming out of here, and it goes into your intake over here. I hope my camera is not making you sick. Anyhow, the way that it's regulated, how much there is, on this system, it's a simple manual valve. As you screw this in, it'll restrict the amount of CNG that goes to your intake, which determines what percentage is actually going to your engine. Again, we're looking for a 50. On the more modern ones where you do have a throttle position sensor, on just the pure CNG that you would put in a gasoline engine, it actually has a stepper motor, and it's electronically controlling the amount of fuel that's going to your engine. And this just goes in line with your low pressure line. And again, as the stepper motor feels like it needs to have more fuel, it actually allows that little plunger to rise up and allow more fuel flow through, or if it needs to reduce it, it shuts it down. Same basic principle here, except we're going to manually screw it in, and then we lock it down with a lock nut as to how much fuel we're getting. And that's how you regulate the percentage of CNG to diesel in this car. The high pressure line. So this is the high pressure line. It's actually got like a plastic coating on it, and it's just a steel line. And it utilizes compression fittings, just like you would in plumbing, where you would slip on your fitting, and then you slip on your compression collar, and then you attach it to it, screw it down, and it'll make a compression fitting. Hold on. Let's see here. Pardon me, walking around. What it looks like when it's actually pinched down, here's a used line that I'm not using anymore. You can see that it actually, gosh, this camera just doesn't focus. You can see that it'll actually compress the line and makes for a leak-free fit. Remember to leak check all your fittings to make sure that you don't have any leaks, as you don't want to have a slow leak of CNG in your engine compartment, have it fill up and whatever, or especially inside your passenger compartment. Okay, so for the fumigation low pressure inlet, I used actually a plumbing fixture. This is for roughing in plumbing in a house. It's a PEX fitting, and then you would nail this to your stud. It's got a cap on it because when you first do your plumbing, you want to pressurize it, make sure it doesn't leak with air, and then you would cut that off, sweat on your fitting and whatever you want to put in for your plumbing. Anyhow, I took that and I modified it so that it'll work for my CNG. And what I did was I cut this side short, and I cut the flange a lot more narrow. I don't know if you're going to be able to see that or not. Yeah, it looks like you can. I cut it at a slight angle just to help a little Venturi effect, and then it just comes down. And I will tie that into my low pressure feed coming off of my regulator. There's my regulator. Comes off. I go through my T that has my shut off so that I can regulate the amount of CNG. And remember, I screw this in. It'll reduce the orifice size here. So I'll put this on the hose with a clamp, and then a hose with a clamp, and then that's how I'll get my CNG, my low pressure CNG, actually to my intake. Again, you want to have it before your turbo. It's a lower pressure, so it's right off of your air box. If you tap into your high pressure, it will not work because this is actually pressurized from your turbocharger. So you don't want to have it on your intake, by your intake. You want to have it just before your turbo, this corrugated pipe. And that's where you'll tap in your fumigation for your CNG. Okay, here's the CNG system. I have an on-off switch. I can either turn it on or off. I used a gas CNG, not a diesel CNG. Normally, if you bought a diesel CNG, this switch here would actually turn on and off your CNG. I had some parts laying around, so I just went ahead and utilized this. What this is basically your fuel gauge, red being empty, and then the more dots you have is the fuller it is. So currently right now the tank is full. I ran this wire here, just ignition straight in. It actually turns on and off your CNG. And if you'll notice here, I do have an EGT indicator. Whether I have CNG or not, if you're doing a lot of hill climbing and stuff like that, you're going to want to watch your EGT. Pretty straightforward on the installation on that. You just got a power wire that goes in. Technically, if you don't want to have a fuel gauge, which I think would be crazy not to, it's just a switch to a solenoid on the regulator valve that turns it on and off. The vacuum actually allows it to flow or not flow. So that's it for the cockpit inside. The tank is mounted in the back. I have a little bit more work to do yet. When you're mounting your tank, you want to use good sturdy brackets. These are actually the factory style brackets that it would come with. These are metal brackets here, but they have a rubber liner, so you want to make sure that you have some kind of protection between the metal and your composite tank or steel tank or whatever tank you're using. You don't want to have this thing rubbing away and causing deterioration of your tank. You'll see here I have my overpressurization, and that just merely gets ported outside. And then I have my high pressure line, and it's kind of hard to see. I've got some coils in it to prevent the tension from going directly to the connection. And that's it for the trunk. And now here's the system inside the engine compartment. Here's my pressure gauge. It tells me it's a transducer. It sends it into the passenger compartment to that gauge I showed you previously. It's wired in. It actually does have an analog gauge on it, but to make it tight and not leak, I had to spin it a little further than I would have liked. Here's my fill valve. Just remove the cap, fill it. This is a 3,000 pound filler valve. It also has another shut-off valve besides the one that's on the tank. I have the high pressure line. It's kind of hard to see. It comes up here. There's a coil in there. and it goes to the bottom of this valve, and then the outlet of this valve goes out to my regulator. And this regulator drops the 3,000 pounds down to the lower pressure. Down in here, if you can see this valve, that's the manual T valve I showed you previously, and you adjust that to the amount of CNG you're getting. Here's the intake into my intake. And then here's the radiator heater hoses, and they go out and they tie into my heater lines on the engine. And again, what that does is it prevents when you have a great pressure drop like you do here, it actually has a cooling effect. It prevents the regulator from freezing. Again, you want to make sure that all your lines are well secured, and that they're not anywhere where something could pinch it, damage it, or anything like that. You want to do inspections every so frequently to make sure that those lines are not getting damaged. And one last note, here's the EGT probe, and it just runs over and it goes in through one of the factory grommets. So that's the CNG system all wrapped up. So far it seems pretty good. I've still got some tweaking to do, and then I got to run what kind of numbers I'm getting out of it as far as you know, is it really worthwhile? I don't know. That's a big tank in your thing. So far I've noticed that the horsepower is greater. Going up the mountain, I don't seem to be temping as fast, and it seems like I got a little more power to climb some pretty big mountains out here. So there it is. It's a big tank, but I think it'll be worth the reducing the pollution, increasing fuel economy, and getting some horsepower out of it. Seems like a win-win aside from the size of that tank. So now I've got the modified coin tray back in place. I cut out a plastic piece, made a little cutout for the switch, a cutout for the CNG, and a cutout for the EGT. It looks really good. Looks kind of factory actually. And that's it.